Welcome to Life Stories, where we explore the deepest emotions, the toughest challenges, and the most inspiring journeys. Today's story is one of heartbreak, resilience, and hope, a journey of a woman who faced betrayal in her own home but found the strength to rebuild her life for the sake of her child. From moments of despair to triumphs of love and forgiveness, this tale reminds us of the power of change and the courage it takes to protect what matters most. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story and discover what it truly means to fight for love and family. I can still remember the rhythmic clicking of Linda's heels on the hardwood floor, a sound that always seemed to echo authority and judgment. She walked with purpose toward James, who was seated in the dining room. The room was warm with the scent of lasagna, the meal I had poured hours into preparing. It was James's favorite, and I had hoped it might be the bridge to finally earn Linda's approval. My stomach churned, not just from the effort of the evening, but from the morning sickness I was enduring at 6 weeks pregnant. No one knew yet. I was saving that precious news for the right moment. Linda leaned down to whisper something into James's ear. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder in what looked like an affectionate gesture. I couldn't hear her words, but I didn't need to. I saw their impact immediately. James's face darkened. His warm brown eyes I had fallen in love with, turned cold and accusatory. He pushed back his chair with a scrape that reverberated through the room. "Is this true?" His voice was sharp, and the question felt like a slap in itself. I didn't even have a chance to respond before he did something I never imagined he was capable of. His hand came down hard against my face, sending me off balance. The shock was more profound than the pain. I stumbled, catching myself against the wall, and brought a trembling hand to my burning cheek. The world spun, and tears welled up in my eyes. But what happened next was something none of us could have anticipated. The nausea I had been suppressing all evening surged. Right there, in front of both of them. I threw up. The room fell into an awkward, deafening silence. James stepped back, his expression twisting from anger to something like disgust. Then he froze. His gaze fell to my purse, which had toppled over when I stumbled. Among its spilled contents lay a small, glaringly obvious plastic stick, a positive pregnancy test. "Emily," he stammered, his face draining of color. "Are you?" I couldn't bring myself to answer right away. My cheek throbbed, and tears streamed down my face. Finally, I whispered, "Yes, I'm pregnant. I was going to tell you tonight. That's why I made your favorite dinner." The weight of what had just happened seemed to crash down on him. James's eyes darted between the pregnancy test and his hand, the same hand he had used to strike me. He took a step forward, reaching out. But I flinched. That flinch was like a slap back to him. I could see the horror and regret written all over his face. Linda, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "James, she's just being dramatic. You know how women can get in these conditions." Her voice was calm, almost clinical, but her words dripped with condescension. I looked at her, realizing in that moment how deep her claws had sunk into my husband. Before anyone could say another word, the sound of a door opening startled us all. Rachel, our neighbor, stood in the doorway. Her face was a mixture of concern and urgency. "I heard shouting," she said, her eyes scanning the scene, my red cheek. James's guilty expression. Linda's composed but tense demeanor. "Is everything okay?" Nothing was okay. I didn't even have to say it. Rachel crossed the room in a few swift strides and placed an arm around my shoulders. "She's coming with me," she announced firmly. "And you'd better not try to stop her." James's voice broke as he tried to protest. "Emily, please." But Rachel didn't let him finish. She guided me out of the house, past Linda's sharp whispers of, "You'll regret this," and out into the cold evening air. At Rachel's house, the reality of what had happened began to set in. My hands shook as I touched my cheek, which now carried the faint imprint of James's hand. Rachel brought me a cup of tea, sitting with me in silence until I finally managed to speak. How did it get this far? My voice cracked under the weight of the question. I wasn't asking Rachel. Really. I was asking myself. How had the man I loved, the man who once made me feel like I was the center of his world, turned into someone capable of this? Rachel didn't answer right away. She just placed her hand over mine and said, "Emily, you didn't deserve that. None of this is your fault." Her words gave me something I hadn't felt in months: validation. It wasn't my fault. The pain, the fear, the betrayal, they weren't mine to own. But they were mine to carry. At least for now. And as I sat there, my hands resting protectively over my stomach, I realized that this moment wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the life growing inside me. My child deserved better. I deserved better. The night dragged on. And with it came a torrent of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion. But by the time the first rays of morning sunlight peeked through Rachel's curtains, one thing was clear: this was a turning point. Whether James could make things right or not, my life and the life of my child would never be the same. The morning after I left, my phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages from James. Each notification brought a wave of mixed emotions: anger, sorrow, and a flicker of hope I couldn't quite extinguish. Most messages were apologies. "I'm so sorry," he wrote. "Please let me explain. I never meant to hurt you." But mixed among his messages were others from Linda. Her tone was far from apologetic. "You're tearing this family apart," one message read. "James is devastated because of your dramatics. A good wife would come home and work things out." I ignored them all. Instead, I focused on my growing baby and what came next. Rachel took charge in ways I hadn't even considered. From calling my workplace to request sick leave to driving me to my first prenatal appointment. The sight of my baby on the ultrasound screen, no larger than a bean, filled me with a bittersweet joy. This was supposed to be a moment shared with James. But instead, it was Rachel holding my hand as the technician pointed out the steady flicker of a heartbeat. That evening, after sending James the recording of the baby's heartbeat, I finally answered his call. His voice cracked with emotion as he apologized repeatedly. But this time, I didn't let him steer the conversation. "James," I said firmly, "I need you to choose. Either Linda moves out, or I'm not coming back. And if I don't come back, I'll be talking to a lawyer about full custody." The line went silent for so long that I wondered if he'd hung up. Then, softly, he said, "You're right. I've already told her she has to leave." "Good," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "But that's not enough. You need help, James. Therapy, couples counseling. And if you ever raise a hand to me again, I'm gone. No discussions. No second chances. I'll press charges. And you'll never see your child again." "I understand," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes." True to his word, Linda moved out the next day, though not without a fight. Rachel filmed the entire ordeal from her driveway as Linda stormed out of our house. Her accusations loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "She's manipulating you," Linda shouted. "You're throwing away your family for her lies." James didn't respond. Instead, he carried her bags to the car, his face pale but determined. The changes didn't stop there. James began therapy immediately, attending sessions twice a week. He sent me photos from the therapist's office as proof. And though I was skeptical at first, his commitment began to chip away at my doubt. When he suggested couples counseling, I agreed, cautiously optimistic but still wary. In our first session, Dr. Ellis, a kind but no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, asked the questions I'd been avoiding. "James, what made you believe Linda over Emily that night? What gave her so much power over your actions?" He hesitated, his hands twisting in his lap. "She's my mom," he finally said. "She's always been there for me. I didn't see how she was manipulating me. Not until it was too late. Dr. Ellis nodded but didn't let him off the hook. And why did you feel the need to respond with violence? His face crumpled as he struggled to find the words. Because I was angry. Not just at Emily, but at myself. I felt like I was losing control, and I didn't know how to handle it. I stayed quiet, letting his words sink in. For the first time, I saw not just my husband but a man unraveling the layers of his own trauma and mistakes. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it gave me a sliver of hope that he was capable of change. Meanwhile, Linda's attempts to reassert her influence continued. She sent gifts to my workplace, expensive trinkets accompanied by notes that dripped with insincerity. Family can't be separated by restraining orders, one card read. James, to his credit, intercepted these gifts and returned them. His growing frustration with his mother evident in every word he shared about her. Despite the turmoil, there were moments of light. James started texting before coming to our counseling sessions, giving me time to prepare emotionally. He began to ask how I was feeling, not out of obligation but genuine concern. It was as though he was relearning how to be a husband. Step by step. By the end of our second week of counseling, Dr. Ellis gave us our first assignment. Decide together on one boundary you both need to feel safe, she said. James didn't hesitate. Linda doesn't come back. Ever. She doesn't visit. She doesn't call. And she doesn't get updates about the baby. I looked at him, surprised by his conviction. Are you sure? He met my gaze. I'm sure. It's time to put you and the baby first. Hearing those words, I felt a small knot in my chest begin to untangle. It wasn't a solution. Not yet. But it was a start. For the first time, I felt like we were walking the same path, however difficult it might be. And for the first time in months, I let myself imagine the possibility of us finding our way back to each other. 2 months passed. And while the wounds on my cheek faded, the emotional scars remained. Counseling became the anchor in a sea of uncertainty. James and I attended sessions weekly, slowly unpacking the years of manipulation Linda had sown into our lives. Dr. Ellis encouraged us to confront hard truths, often pulling back layers of pain we had long buried. One session in particular stood out. Tell me about the first time you noticed Linda's influence on your marriage. Dr. Ellis prompted. James leaned forward, rubbing his hands together nervously. It was a few months after we got married. Emily had planned this beautiful birthday dinner for me, cooked everything from scratch. But earlier that day, Mom surprised me with lunch. She already knew about the dinner because Emily told her. But she acted like she didn't. He paused, his voice thick with regret. When I got home, Mom started saying how we needed to be careful with money, how Emily was wasting our resources on expensive ingredients. I didn't think twice about it. I complained to Emily about the cost of the meal. I remembered that night vividly. I had spent hours preparing, only to have him dismiss my effort with a few careless words. I had cried alone in the kitchen while James and Linda sat in the living room, laughing at a TV show. Hearing him recount it now, with genuine remorse, was both painful and oddly healing. The old patterns run deep, Dr. Ellis said, but recognizing them is the first step to breaking free. By the time I was 5 months pregnant, we had begun to find our rhythm again. James moved back into the house cautiously, under strict conditions. Linda was entirely cut off, no visits, no calls, no updates about the baby. James followed through on his promises, even filing a restraining order against her after she showed up at my school. Watching the entrance from her car, when the police arrived, Linda played the victim. But the video evidence Rachel and my classroom aide had captured told a different story. That night, James and I sat across from each other in our living room. I'm sorry for everything, he said quietly, for letting her control our lives, for not seeing how much it was hurting you. His voice cracked. And for that night, I'll never forgive myself. I looked at him, tears welling up in my eyes. I won't pretend it's easy to forget, James. But you're showing me that you're trying. That means something. For the first time in months, I felt a fragile hope begin to take root. We began to prepare for Lily's arrival with a sense of cautious optimism. James repainted the nursery in soft pastels, carefully choosing shades of green and yellow. He replaced the dining table where the incident had occurred with a round, welcoming oak table. No more hierarchy, he said with a faint smile. This is a table for family. Despite our progress, Linda wasn't done. She sent a silver rattle to my school, claiming it was a family heirloom that couldn't be kept away by restraining orders. James returned it immediately through legal channels, reinforcing the boundary we had set. She's testing us, he said grimly. But we're not letting her win. The moment that solidified our resolve came at our next prenatal appointment. The technician turned the screen toward us, showing Lily's tiny form. Would you like to know the gender? She asked. James looked at me, and I nodded. It's a girl, the technician said with a smile. A girl. I placed my hand protectively over my growing belly, thinking about the life we were bringing into the world. James reached for my other hand, his touch hesitant but steady. She'll never know what we went through, he said softly. She'll only know love. For the first time, I believed him. The walls we had built around ourselves to protect from Linda's influence were strong. The steps James had taken, therapy, boundaries, accountability, were real. And as I looked at the ultrasound screen, I realized we weren't just fighting for ourselves. We were fighting for her. That night, as we sat in the nursery, surrounded by books and stuffed animals we had chosen together, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. James wrapped his arms around me gently, resting his chin on my shoulder. Thank you, he whispered. For what? I asked, leaning into him. For giving me a chance to be the man I should have been all along. For Lily. For you. I closed my eyes, letting his words sink in. We're not there yet, James. But we're getting closer. In that moment, I knew that while the road ahead would still be challenging, we had taken the first steps toward building a new life, one where love, trust, and safety would always come first. As the sun set on our quiet home, I watched Lily sleep peacefully in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. The journey we had taken to get here, through pain, forgiveness, and hard-fought healing, was etched in every moment of peace we now cherished. James sat beside me, his hand resting on mine. We did it. Emily, he whispered. We're building the life we always dreamed of. For her. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. And we'll keep doing it. One step at a time. Lily stirred, letting out a soft coo. And we both smiled. Love had won. Not without struggle. But it had triumphed. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories of life, love, and resilience. See you in the next video.